Thanks to social media and the rise of mobile apps, millions of readers worldwide follow and enjoy online comics of every genre on a day-to-day basis. With a wealth of publishing options, new creators have more chances than ever to make a name in this vibrant part of the comics ecosystem. But launching and maintaining online comics, never mind connecting with potential readers, isn't easy. A webcomic creator isn't just an artist or an author. They also have to be marketers and business people and bring many skills to the table in order to make things work. Today, 5 veteran creators from all walks of life discuss how they built their comics and what they learned in the process. Together, they'll talk you through how to do the thing and keep your sanity while doing it. Our video comes to you courtesy of Thought Bubble Fringe, an all-digital comics event taking place alongside the 2020 Thought Bubble Comics Festival. Now, let's meet the panel.
My name is Ashling. I go by Ashling Draws online. My current ongoing webcomic is called The Enchanted Book. It's a fantasy adventure kind of love story about two girls trying to save the world from monsters while also going on a journey of self-discovery.
My name is Eve Greenwood, and I do the webcomic Inhibits, which is about teenagers with superpowers uncovering a government conspiracy. It's very, very silly, but we just got to the meat of a very serious mystery which centers the whole story.
Harry Connor. I use they pronouns, and I make a comic called Finding a Home, which I normally describe as a slow burn romance set in a fantasy world, which is hosted on Tapas and Webtoons.
My name's Sean. I write under the pen name The Starlight City Project. I'm the writer and creator of Ariel Persona. It's a sci-fi fantasy action webcomic that gets published every Wednesday on illpersona.com.
I'm Ty Dunitz. I'm one half of the team behind Rising Sand, along with Jen Lee. The story of a girl, Doll, who learns that the sun is imminently falling and threatening the planet, and with a healthy desire not to be dead, Doll joins a band of gun-toting scientists who are themselves hell-bent on holding the sky together.
And I'm your friendly neighborhood moderator, I.O. Black, co-writer of Drugs and Wires, a weekly webcomic set in the dark cyberpunk future of 1995. Yeah, you heard me. To kick things off, let's talk a little bit about how we got into webcomics and where things went from there.
I've been doing webcomics for maybe 2 pages a week for 7 years. And also when I was a teenager, I did them for a couple of years then as well.
Rising Sand was originally meant as a tabletop role-playing game, long before D&D was cool. And at one point, I realized that before letting players loose to tell their own stories in my world, I thought it might be a fun exercise to try to tell one of my own and kind of go for a bottom-up approach from a character perspective. And at that point, Rising Sand was going to be a novel until I told Jen about it, at which point she almost immediately began inundating me with fan art of the characters and ideas I was coming up with. And I found that incredibly compelling. And here we are. And it's a free comic on the internet for some reason.
I first sort of got into comics when I was a literal child. I grew up reading a Brazilian comic called Turma da Mônica. I was 4 years old when I started making comics, and when I think it was 2008 when I started making webcomics, and it was really just wanting to be sort of part of a community. I didn't realize that you could make comics and share it and stuff.
I would draw comics in notebooks and pass them around class when I was at school. Hundreds of pages of comics, super long. I've always done really long form stuff. So I think that maybe webcomics was a obvious progression to me, because I was already just trying to share what I was making with as many people as possible.
I actually started off as a prose writer. Inhibit was a story I wrote when I was 17 years old. And I had it in my head that I wanted to be a published author. I was going to write prose stories. And I wasn't really interested in drawing comics. I like to draw, but I got really low grades in art. I didn't go to art school. But I was reading webcomics since I was about 16, 17. And it wasn't until I was about 20 that I started to realize webcomics were such an accessible medium. They're so easy to publish online. It's free to publish it online. You just need to be able to draw the bare minimum it doesn't have to be the most beautiful thing in the world at the start, because by its very nature, webcomics like grow and improve. So once I realized just how easy they were as a way to share a story, I became obsessed with the idea of making one. So I shifted from writing prose to thinking about the story in a comic, and just went from there.
And I think the other thing is that when I was younger, I didn't necessarily feel like I didn't have friends who were big into like Cape comics or even manga. And I didn't necessarily feel welcomed by like comic shops and stuff, whereas obviously webcomics were like free and very accessible. And so they kind of felt like something, maybe this is less true now, but back in like 2005 or something, it felt like there was like lots of different kinds of comics and different like standards of artwork and stuff. So it felt like, yeah, maybe I could do that too.
Basically, it's been a lifelong passion of mine to write comics, but it took me a while to get the resources and the courage, basically, to actually put my foot out there, start writing, recruiting artists and things like that.
My formal education is in editorial illustration and a bit of branding as well. And I thought that I was going to have a career, just doing magazine illustrations and whatnot. And for a time after university, I started getting into doing album covers for death metal bands and key art for video games. Jen's background is in self-publishing. Like she has been published and had been published several times, and she was starting a web comic with another friend around the time that I was kind of coming up with ideas for Rising Sand. It was very far behind. They weren't making much headway with it. And when she started, showing me all this artwork, I was kind of just like, oh, well, what you were doing over there looks fun. Why don't we just turn this into that?
Around 2013, I began networking on various websites that posted jobs for artists. And through there, I managed to make several different contacts, and I was able to start getting character designs done and everything like that. And I would say like around late 2013, maybe November, December, I met the artists that I work with now through Studio Skill 3, JM Valenzuela, he's a line artist, and Ludwig Sacramento, he does our coloring and lettering, and he just does a lot of good project management for us. And we started creating the comic Ariel Persona. And at first, it wasn't going to be a web comic. It was basically going to be just a regular standard comic. But once 2015 rolled around, I was wondering how to get myself out there. And I realized that putting my comics behind a paywall wouldn't necessarily be conducive to exposing people to my work. So I basically decided to launch it as a web comic, and we've been doing it for the last 5 years now.
Let's talk a bit about groundwork. What does it take to go from a raw idea to something that's actually ready for prime time? How much writing and pre-planning would you recommend people do?
There's kind of two answers to that, like concept versus the actual production work. And regarding the former, like we're obviously several years into this now, and I've had many would-be webcomic authors who come to me and are like, oh, Ty, I'm going to be launching my webcomic soon, and I just need a little more world building and you're going to love it, but I'm not launching it yet. I'm going to do it soon. There's more prep that needs to be done. And like from a concept perspective, and like these people who come up to me, like they're the kind of people who have like who post on Twitter literal binderfuls of the work they're doing on the world building and literal stacks and stacks of ideas to brag about how many ideas they have. And that's great. That's wonderful. But people like that are always going to find an excuse to say just a little more.
I definitely fell into the hole of obsessing over stuff, and one of those things was like languages. I was like literally trying to really quickly as well, and obviously unsuccessfully, learn like Arabic and Korean and stuff in order to build up these languages. And after a point I was just like, this is too much.
The fact is, you will find those excuses and you will never hit go if you can avoid it.
Especially people with a background in illustration, a lot of creators who are just starting doing a webcomic feel like they have to like wait until they're good enough at drawing to start, or wait until they have enough ideas about the story to be able to start doing a webcomic. And I almost feel like the opposite of that, because I feel like I learned so much through doing the comics. Like, the reason that I knew that the print format was wrong is like trying to print the book in 2017 or something when the webcomic was finished, and even stuff like figuring out what is a good day to update on and what's a good like size format, and like doing the roughs on paper versus doing them on an iPad, and all of that stuff is like really stuff that I learned by actually trying to do the webcomic. And I think that there's only so much you can prep.
I'm basically just a huge advocate for like starting and seeing what happens. I did like some character designs I did on the page that they appeared first in. Just go for it.
Conversely, from a production standpoint, if you have found it in your heart to hit go and actually start working, you want to have all of it done, or as close to all of it as you can, because like I mean, obviously people are familiar with the concept of a buffer. Like, the buffer is the only thing that allows a webcomic and real life to harmoniously coexist. And you know, if you don't have enough of that done, like, because if you're just excited to hit go and just show people the work that you've done because, you know, you spent so long thinking about it and you just want that sweet satisfaction, the likes and the comments and whatnot, like, that's the quickest way to burn out. That's the quickest way to have a dearth of content. That's the quickest way to injury. That I have one right now.
You really need to know exactly what your vision looks like. You can't approach an artist and have your idea half baked. If you do, it's not going to turn out right, because then you're going to be asking for constant revisions and it's just going to make everyone unhappy. So know what you want ahead of time. Leave little room for error. And even in my scripts, when I write, I include reference pictures, things like that, so the artist can interpret what I'm writing in their own way, but it'll be done in a way where I think both sides will be happy as far as the outcome, because if you're specific and detailed enough, like I said, it leaves little room for error.
It's going to be a different amount you need to prep for different people. I actually don't do a lot of drawing before I start doing a comic. And if I'm not doing like a pitch for a publisher or an anthology, I don't do like full character turnarounds and, you know, drawings of each setting or any of that stuff, because I'm able to not do that. And with my health, the like visual, the actually sitting up and drawing part of it is the thing that's like most like painful or like difficult.
Creating the Enchanted book, it took 2 years of development, and it started off actually as a project for my 4th year animation, and I was like developing it after I graduated, and I was fine-tuning it to a point where I was happy finally putting the story out there, but I am still fine-tuning it as I'm going.
I think I would say that having an ending in mind, if it is the kind of format that's a continuous story rather than like short episodes or like a gag strip or something, is always good, because then you just have an idea of like where the characters are going to end up.
Okay, you do need to know how the story starts, but if you know where the characters end up at the end, everything else that you're figuring out in the middle, you can do, you know, even while you're creating the story, as long as you know where that's all leading up to.
Yeah, but I guess I just feel like people should just jump in, because you're going to probably get if it's the first webcomic you've ever done, you're probably going to get 5 or 10 pages in and be like, oh, I actually need to start in a totally different place. Or I'm actually going to draw this character totally different. I gave them way too many details on their clothes or whatever.
It's scary to do something like this, to take this kind of leap, particularly like, you know, if you kind of know what's up and you know what you're getting yourself into.
I kind of just feel like you're going to make mistakes. So you should just try and do it and figure out what those mistakes are and learn from them.
So, you've got your first pages, you know where your story's going, you're ready to make things happen. Let's talk about launch. How do you get online? And how do you make a splash to let people know you've arrived? What are some of the things you have to look at once you've launched?
You have to temper your expectations, first of all, because you never know what's going to happen, especially since you're an independent creator. So your outreach is always going to be limited. But you always want to make sure that you do your homework, know your audience, and basically just put in the groundwork first before you even launch anything. You want to make people aware of what you're doing, so they'll be maybe interested to check it out when you finally launch it.
You need to manage your expectations because, you know, so many authors, so many new authors, you know, they've read their Lackadaisies and their Meeks and their Kill 6 Billion Demons, and, you know, thoroughly inspired, they create their own story. And, you know, it's a fine webcomic. It has beautiful art and an engaging story and keyboard navigation, and they're still bummed because they don't have, you know, a readership 1,000 strong. And, you know, that's the big thing about webcomics, right? Like, it's not an overnight vocation. You're gonna be here a while, so, like, you know, pull up a chair and grab a blanket and set the microwave to potato.
In hindsight, I don't think that I did the launch for the Enchanted book too well. But what I will say is that it's quite not important, but I think it's very helpful if you're getting people invested in your characters and their story before launching the webcomic, before you even say that it's going to be a webcomic. If you've got sketches of your characters interacting, if you've got, like, you know, bits of lore and stuff that you can post on, like, Instagram and Twitter and that, to get people sort of engaged with your characters and the story, then that really helps you when you do launch to create a sort of base of people to read. Because I think when you have a new story, when you have a new webcomic, I think people do pay attention to how many subscribers a webcomic has when it's launched. And I think that if there's already, even if it's just like 5 or 10 people that are subscribed to your webcomic, then that's more that encourages people to see what all the fuss is about, you know.
Highly recommend starting with an entire chapter, or like at least scene, to hook readers in. There's a lot of webcomics which start with just the first page, and it looks great, but I'm not going to come back because I'm not like invested. There's nothing here that's really hooking me in. And you want the very first thing that new readers see to be something that they're, oh, I'm going to come back, or oh, I'm going to subscribe.
For me, the motivation of having like 1 or 2 people commenting is a big difference from trying to draw a 200-page comic that you like never show to anyone. And I think it helped me motivate myself when I was starting out, because it's like I felt like I had to do a couple of pages every week because I decided that was it.
Try everything at first for like the first couple of weeks, maybe like a couple of months. Try to post like Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, Reddit, Tumblr, just to like, cast out your lines, see where people are biting, and immediately like reel them back in if nothing's working. Because when I launched Inhibit, I made a Facebook page, I posted on Reddit, I posted on forums, just to like see where the interest lay. And I was like, okay, Twitter and Tumblr are my 2 interest bases. I'm just going to focus all my attention on there. And that way, like, I knew straight away from launch where to focus my attention.
You definitely want to get out there on social media. You want to interact with people. You want to let people know who you are. Hey, this is what I do. You want people to see your work. So you want to constantly be posting things out. Nowadays, I think earlier as I started, I was constantly bombarding social media, which it helped in a way, but um, but now I've established certain things for myself where I can feel like I could just put things out, not sporadically, but just leave little inklings and droppings of what I'm doing. But you definitely got to use social media to your advantage. Twitter is more for like networking. Facebook, I'm not a fan of the platform. And Instagram, I feel, is a really good way for people, especially comic creators, to get their work out there. You could upload like different you could upload like whole pages. You could upload snippets of something, or like I do, I turn my comics into videos. That's another way I get my work out there.
Yeah, and the last thing is to just pretend that everyone is already reading it and already excited about it. When I launched Inhibit, I was probably like a little naive. I wasn't really doing this on purpose, but I was like, everyone is so excited for my webcomic. Everyone is going to read it. Everyone is reading every update. So that like enthusiasm and excitement about my own work, I think, was a little infectious, and it can make people be like, oh, like what is this thing that seems so exciting that everyone seems to be reading? No one is reading it. It was like 3 people, but like that attitude, I think, is really important, even if it's not true and you know it's not true. Treating it like a big event and continuing to treat it like a big event every time has proven for me quite helpful for like slowly filtering in maybe more of an audience than I would have otherwise.
A new creator does have a lot of options available when it comes to hosting, including their own website. What are the options out there? And from your experience, what are some of the things that creators should consider when making a decision about where their work is going to show up?
So I'm definitely someone who's always used host websites of some description or another, because for me, a lot of the like appeal of doing a webcomic is putting the comic somewhere people can read it. And when I started doing webcomics, I didn't have any Twitter followers. I didn't have any Instagram followers at all. Like the place that people found my stuff was the webcomics. So, but obviously, if you're someone who already has like a established following on some other platform, like whatever that is, you can kind of post your comics wherever. Like if what you're expecting to do is direct your existing like followers or readers or whatever somewhere, then you can like make your own website. You can do anything.
I think investing in building your own website, having your own URL, everything connected to that property that you're putting out there is number one. You have to have your own website because you want to have control of your own platform to deliver your work out to the public. You want to have that website so you could build a community of readers on your own without relying on third parties. I think it's critical to do that.
I have had experience with basically every comics platform because I was on Tapas, Webtoons, SmackJeeves, I'm on Comic Fury now. What's worked really well for me, because I'm of the old school webcomic mind where I want my own website that I can, decorate thematically. I have this whole theory about how webcomics are their own medium, mostly because of like the presentation. You can get webcomics like Drugs and Wires is a really good example. It feels like it exists in the world, and there's webcomics which have like the sites have decorative elements that kind of tie in the themes of the story. So I love having my own website, and for that, I used to be on SmackJeeves, which you cannot use anymore. Now I'm on Comic Fury, which is actually really, really good. They have a lot of really good options and a lot of really good things you can change, and you can completely change the HTML. The downside to Comic Fury is it's not a huge reader base, and you do have to attract readers yourself for the most part.
I decided to go for Comic Fury because I wanted a platform that was customizable and not scary. So I don't know anything. I don't know a thing about coding. I've tried and failed. So I just wanted something that was easily customizable with a good community of people that would, potentially help me out if I needed any help with the customization of my comic site. And I've also seen that people are able to get their own custom domains on Comic Fury as well. So that's also a potential option for me. Comic Fury was just a bit less scary to approach than like WordPress, for example. Even though I've heard it's easy to use, but for me, I'm just like, oh, I don't know.
Tapas I did try, and I wasn't as fussed with it. But Webtoons and Tapas do both have that inbuilt audience where you don't need to make as much of an effort because you're in the search bar, you're in the genres, people can like upvote you.
Tapas has its own events like Inksgiving, which is just like ink is the way that you do coins in that app. So you can do stuff where you're like, oh, if I get 10,000 ink, if people tip me enough, I'll release a special drawing or whatever. And yeah, I just feel like it's one of the bonuses of it as a host site is it lets you link in the description, which Webtoons doesn't, which I find very difficult because it means I can't link directly to like the Kickstarter I'm doing or anything, which is not helpful to me. Which means it's really easy to also be like, hey, check out my friend's comic. Like if you like Finding Home, I think you'll really like this comic and you should check it out, which is really nice.
Webtoons was really, really good as a free creator for a couple of years because they were paying a lot of money for hits, but recently that money has been decreasing. So if you're wanting a platform which will give you a good payout, Webtoons is good for the higher end of your view count, but you do also need to adapt your comic for a mobile format if you want to be successful on Webtoons, because all of the readers want long updates and they want mobile format. So I have been doing that with Inhibit. I chop up the comic and I post every 2 weeks or twice a month at least. It's really what you want as a starting creator. If you want to put in the work to draw in an audience and you're happy making your own website, which is really, really easy with Comic Fury, or if you want to just find an audience right away. And you can do both because I do my own website and I also post on Webtoons as my mirror, and it's been really good for building more of an audience.
If a goal is to have lots of people reading your comic, or just like an easy to use comment section where there's like a chance people might want to interact with your stuff, that's what host sites are good for. Like they don't guarantee an audience, but it's maybe more likely someone will just stumble across what you're making.
Yeah, they're cool. It's good to mirror your work on there because you never know. You could get a reader that is so engaged in your work that they'll follow you right to your website. That's happened to me a lot, especially through Webtoons. People, I'll put the URL there, and then people will go subscribe to my YouTube page, or they'll just pop up in the reader comments saying, "Hi, I followed you here from Webtoons," and that's great. And I think that should be the point of using mirror platforms, is just to get other eyes on your work. Because even if one person decides, hey, I like this comic so much, I'm going to follow it directly, then that's a victory for you. So
God knows I have my problems with places like Tapas and Webtoon and whatnot, but I also, you can't blame anybody for using them. There's enormous built-in audiences on those platforms. So like, as long as you can keep in mind that platforms are not your friends and exist only to leech off of what success you may be able to grab, then you're golden. I would suggest getting your own website. It's fairly cheap and easy to do. But then there's the whole promotion thing. It's a little harder to get eyeballs, but there's obviously pros and cons to any.
Certainly there's like technical constraints, and yes, there may definitely be stuff like what the host website will actually let you host if you have adult content, or even like anything that the host site thinks is adult content.
Tumblr went through a sort of awkward stage as well, where it would censor random things. It was like this whole thing about like censoring nudity and stuff like that, porn, and it would falsely sort of censor things that weren't nudity or porn at all. And so a few of my pages were subjected to that. And the Enchanted Book is completely PG, just by the by. And it was the thing where if you said no, please, like if you contested the censorship, your page or your artwork or whatever it was would be posted back, but it would be like in the wrong place. It would be like the page 30 would be like the first thing that you see when you click on the Tumblr site.
I would think that the one thing you need to always remember when publishing on third-party platforms is to view the terms of service, constantly review them, because intellectual property, you don't want to play games with publishers and your intellectual property. You want to make sure that their terms of service are to your liking, to where they can't use your work outside of, just it being posted on the website. The reason I left Tap is I'm not going to badmouth the website or anything like that, but they had made some language changes in their terms of service, which made me feel uncomfortable about leaving my property on there. So I left the platform.
I left Tapas for all of their kind of shady things going on with their terms and services, and then just the changing the platform to look more like Webtoons. I was just like, I'm not interested in Tapas anymore, so I left. I was on Smack Jeeves, and that was sold off to a company which did not care about its readership at all. Smack Jeeves is now actually blocked in the EU, which is interesting.
But other authors still use it, and they see success on it. So I wouldn't say don't use it. I would just say for every third party, it doesn't matter if it's Smack Jeeves, Webtoons, Tapas. I'm drawing a blank on any other ones that may be out there right now, but make sure you read those terms of services. Make sure that your IP is not being infringed on by any of their rules, because you just never know. You have to always watch your back.
The Enchanted Book was on Smack Jeeves and Tumblr, two platforms that totally disintegrated in terms of webcomic making. I think Tumblr is having a bit of a resurgence with the fandom stuff. But yeah, just be prepared, have a sort of backup plan. Like before Smack Jeeves went down, Tapas was a backup plan for me. So that wasn't too bad when I had to let go of Tumblr. But yeah, just have a backup plan, and whatever happens. Anything can happen. It doesn't even necessarily need to be in regards to the platform. It can be just in life, anything can happen.
You are beholden to the platforms that you use. Social media is terrible for people trying to promote stuff. If they're hiding posts with links, how are you supposed to link anywhere? Instagram doesn't let you link anywhere. All these websites are very sticky because you can't take people away from them. They're stuck to that website. Webtoons is the same. You can't make clickable URLs.
But you have to remember, if you pull your comics off of that platform, will the readers follow you back to your own platform, or will they just say, hey, well, this is not on here anymore, so I'm just going to move on to the next story that I see on there? And that's the thing that is, you have to keep in mind, that while you're using that third-party platform, it's not your platform. And even though you can build an audience on there, it's still not your audience technically. It's the Webtoons or Tapas audience, people who go to visit many comics, not just yours.
I almost feel like sometimes people think of webcomic host sites as they're like a business, and they don't owe you anything, and they have loads of creators. So unfortunately, it definitely is the case that you might be posting on the website that has the most comic readers in the world and just get no traction, because there's no real incentive for them to necessarily feature creators that they don't think are gonna do well, in the same way that Twitter doesn't care about you. The algorithm for Twitter doesn't care about you, which is really difficult, I think, if you're making, because comics just take absolutely ages.
Money might be the root of all evil, but monetization is still an important thing to think about as you're planning your webcomic. What are some of the revenue opportunities a creator has out there, and what should they keep in mind as they explore them?
With making money from a webcomic, it's quite hard, especially when you are a smaller creator, especially when your webcomic is still in its infancy.
Monetization really isn't something that you can think about until you've been doing this a while. Obviously, there's also Ko-fi, which you can give a a couple of bucks here and there. There's PayPal like donations and all this stuff. But it's not something you can think about until you've established yourself, you have an audience. I think, what is it people say, like 10% of your audience will give you any money at all. Like 5% will give you like a big amount, maybe 1%. So when you are just starting off and you don't have a pre-established audience, or you don't have much of a readership already, that number is going to be minuscule.
A webcomic is something that we're like 2 or 3 years in, you're still just a baby. There are webcomics that have been going for 20 years and like only now are household names. So you just gotta sit back and chill and, you know, wait. It's all about waiting.
I think for me, when I was starting out, actually the biggest monetization, if you can really call it that, was just like printing my comics and selling them like online as well as at conventions, and actually printing my books and sort of having like long trade paperback, I guess basically graphic novel versions on Kickstarter.
I would assume one would want to collect their comic into a physical volume at some point. There's no greater feeling in the world than seeing the blood and sweat that you've poured into a digital void for the last several years. You know, holding it in your hands as a book is pretty awesome.
Yeah, it hits you like, you're like, oh crap, like I just made a comic. Like that's when it hit me. I was like, I'm really actually doing the stuff that I was always thinking about. Like, oh, for years I went about saying, hey, I want to make a comic, but I never did it. But when I actually sat down, focused, and put the work in to actually create it, when I first held it in my hands, it was like holding a newborn baby. It was like, I made this. Like, it was just incredible.
Some people love the format of webcomics. Other people actually really like having a big chunk of stuff that they can read physically, or even like a big PDF that they can read. So for me, turning it into an ebook or a physical book was something that definitely helped make money at a time where like I kind of needed to be making money to be able to keep making the webcomic.
People love physical copies of stuff. Like, it's great that, you know, you can go online and read your comic, but people also like to have the comic in their hand. So learn how to format your stuff, learn how to get your stuff printed up. There's a lot of different avenues. I know here in the US we have I think it's called Greco Print. I've been using them for the last few years to print up copies of my work for shows and things like that.
In my mind from the start, I was like, I want a book, because I wanted my prose books when I was younger, and now I'm like, I want a big chunky graphic novel. So I was like, yes, I am going to print it. I did the barest amount of research. Okay, 300 DPI looks great. I picked a random page size and I just went for it. I didn't know about CMYK versus RGB. I didn't know about bleed. I was just like, it's fine. So when I went back to print my first book, I was like, oh, I have to fix some of these colors because they're not going to print. I needed to add a bunch of bleed because you do need like a bit around the page in order to print it. I ended up printing at a very strange size. It's like, it looks good, but it's a weird size to print at because I made my pages slightly wider than they really should have been. So at least I drew it at 300 DPI. And it wasn't too much of a hassle.
You'd be surprised if you have the work already done. Then getting on Kickstarter, I think is definitely an avenue that all webcomic creators should look forward to, because you know you could actually see some return on the time that you've actually invested in creating your work.
If it's helpful, I would say that most of my money right now in the pandemic comes from Patreon, and then like a much smaller fraction comes from Tapas Early Access. Very little is from ad revenue, just because you can get hundreds of thousands of views, and actually that doesn't really translate into like a lot of money from the advertisers.
Patreon is obviously the big one, but I wouldn't recommend launching your Patreon with your webcomic unless you have a pre-established audience. I didn't launch my Patreon until a few years after I launched the webcomic. And I think some new creators will be disappointed when they launch their Patreon and maybe get a couple of patrons or none. And it can be very demotivating to say, hey, would you like to pay me for all this work I'm doing? And have like one person see like, okay, here's like $1.
You know, when you start a Patreon, you have all these huge plans on, you know, the kinds of things that you're going to give to the people who are so gracious as to give you money. And that has always, even today, is, you know, an enormous source of stress, because, you know, not only are you making this comic that takes an enormous amount of your free time. I mean, like me and Jen are lucky enough that we have almost full time to devote to Rising Sand. Like there's very little time that needs to be partitioned for other things. And I can only imagine what it's like for somebody who, you know, has to work 9 to 5 and then come home and work on a webcomic and then decide what kinds of things they're going to do for their Patreon.
I've thought about it, like maybe offering behind the scenes looks and things like that, but at this time it's not something that I have too much confidence in, because I don't know how much people would really want to pay to see the boring side of me going through drafts of my scripts, or me putting together videos and things like that.
Try to make those things that you are offering as patron rewards things you were already doing, because it's so much more work to try to do bespoke things outside of the scope of the webcomic than it is to, say, let them in on the background. Like, as a quick example, like, you know, just giving them a behind the scenes look of how the webcomic came together, because you already have that shit. That's just sitting there in a pile, and it's to the reader, that's solid gold, because they get to see behind the curtain and they get to see what you're working on, as opposed to, say, you know, we're going to do extra art and we're going to offer wallpapers and we're going to do all these extra little things. Like Jen and I tried that in the beginning, and like we canceled all that really quickly, because it was literally like doing an extra webcomic on top of the webcomic we were already burnt out on.
Patreon as well is also really good. It's really important to keep, you know, advertising it. I'm not amazing at advertising my own stuff. That's just like personal issues. But yeah, definitely like reminding people that it's there and trying to, like, you know, provide a little bit of extra content, whether that's an additional page or wallpapers and stuff like that.
Well, the other thing that I do that's probably quite it isn't the way that most people do comics, is that Finding Home is about 9 months ahead on Patreon right now, and that's been true for maybe like a year. So it means that if you subscribe on Patreon, you're reading like a really long way ahead. And so when the books come out, you might want to buy the book because it's way ahead of the public webcomic. And if you're on Tapas, you might want to pay for the early access because you can read like at least a month ahead.
So Tapas has two sort of major forms of like making money. So the first one is the ink support, and the second one is ad revenue. And both of those things are very difficult to get money from, but it's worth, you know, obviously enabling so that you do get some money. So with the ad revenue, you can actually withdraw your money until you hit $25 worth of money. I think that's a combination actually of the ad revenue that you get as well as the ink support that you can get.
Some host sites have like a program, and so the program that I'm on with Tapas is that I can post it other places and I can still have a Patreon, which is much further ahead. But people can like pay to unlock the next like 6 episodes on the app.
Tapas has that option where you can like tip creators and you get like a couple of cents. And Webtoons has a program where you get money based on views. You do have to have a lot of views on Webtoons, and I think 40,000 subscribers minimum to be eligible to get that money. And it's also becoming increasingly less worth it as the program goes on, because there are so many creators that they're decreasing the amount, they're upping the views and, like, you know, statistics you need to get. So I don't really know what that's going to be like in a couple of years.
I think it's very hard to make money on ad revenue nowadays. Obviously, that's something you could do in like 10 or 20 years ago.
You could also cut out the middleman and sell space directly to people, but you have to have a good amount of page views and traffic coming through your website before you think about doing that. I mean, if no one's viewing your site, then what's the point of someone buying an ad? I went through a few different ad providers and I managed to get Google Ads on my site. So even if you go on ilpratana.com and you turn your ad blocker off, you'll see ads for stuff that are probably geared towards your interest and things like that. That has helped a lot.
We've started streaming publicly. We used to have streaming as a patron specific sort of thing, but in recent weeks, as you yourself have no doubt noticed, we've started doing it publicly and just, reaping sub money from that. And when I say reaping, I mean, it's not a lot yet, but it's another revenue stream. It's a chance to interact with the readership on a very personal level. So for people who are, willing and able to put that effort in, because it can be exhausting being in front of a camera, sort of like it is right now, to perform essentially well, showing them all the the warts and all of the creation process. That's a pretty good way to go.
And for the artists that are doing webcomics especially, you guys have an advantage over me because you could create artwork anytime you want. Me, I'd have to commission someone to do it. So that's why, like, outside of the comics itself, I don't do a lot of merchandising as far as selling stuff on my website. I just sell the comics basically, but you guys can make pins and enamels or you can make posters or just prints and things like that to sell. So that's something to keep in mind as well.
Finding, growing, and keeping an audience can be one of the biggest challenges for a creator. What are some of the options that are available in terms of promotion?
Post on social media. Unfortunately, you have to post on social media now. A lot of the channels that I used to promote Inhibit when it first started aren't really relevant anymore. Like Top Web Comics isn't really relevant. I did participate in webcomic chat a lot when I first started, and I think that really helps me as a creator to meet other creators. I'm not really sure about meeting more of an audience, but it was good to kind of integrate myself into the webcomic scene a little bit, because I was like getting to know the other, my colleagues, basically the other people in my career. So I would highly recommend participating in hashtag events, like a lot of the visibility tags.
Visible Women, Portfolio Day, just make sure that you're always tagging your webcomic in that. There's webcomic profiles or webcomic related profiles like webcomic updates that you can, if your webcomic updates, you make a post about it, you tag them or use a hashtag or webcomic or something.
Over time, seeing someone updating every single week means that you remember the name of the comic, and like if you see it, you might be like, oh, this time I'll read it. Recently, I have a tiny Discord for Finding Home, and I was posting every time I updated on the Discord, and I was like, oh, no one interacts with this. I don't even know if anyone uses the Discord. I just wanted some way of people being able to see the updates that you didn't have to be following me on like Twitter or whatever to see them. And I stopped doing them. And someone in the Discord was like, hey, where are these? Where have you stopped doing those updates? And I was like, oh, I didn't know if anyone was like looking at them. And a bunch of people were like, yeah, that was helpful for me. That was really helpful for me.
And I know I just said to talk about it like everyone is already reading it. You also need to talk about it like no one is reading it. Every time you post a picture, you need to include a link to your comic. You need to introduce it every now and then. You need to be like, oh, hey, I'm halfway through the chapter. You should check it out. I just finished a chapter. You should check it out.
Consistently telling people that like it's something that you're making and you're like seriously doing it and it updates every Monday or whatever, it like actually has a lot of value, even if it feels like people aren't really interacting.
Try YouTube if you have the resources or capabilities to produce videos. That would be a good thing, because it's another channel.
I just tweet about it and cross my fingers. I have no idea. I'm not a self-promotion guy. We've never paid for ads. Perhaps that would help.
I wouldn't say Google AdWords or whatever they call it now is a good for everyone. People that I've talked to had different experiences on it. It's helped me as far as because I was able to key in on certain websites that I knew would, maybe bring traffic. But you have to really do your homework on that platform if you're going to use it for advertising your comic. Also, you have to make sure that it works for your budget because not everybody has money to spend on ads. I've even decreased what I spend on there.
We use Top Webcomics, but it's you can only cheat to win on Top Webcomics, so it's not exactly the best.
I think it's great. I see comics from people that I'm cool with online, that develop relationships online. I see they're in the top 100 or whatever. I'm just like that. That's great. It's like free advertising. Like, why not take advantage of it? They offer reasonable rates, and the placements that you get on their website are pretty decent. Get yourself some advertising space if you can. I think that'll be a big help as far as getting yourself going.
Instagram as well, you can sort of use it. It's not as shareable as Twitter.
Through the first few years of publishing Ariel Persona, I did multiple giveaways, and for me it was no problem. I would just get a $25 Amazon gift card or something like that, or I'd offer my readers a chance at getting actual physical copies of the book. So that was a good way because that also helped to build up my mailing list. And I think it's key to establish a mailing list, especially if you're going to be doing things outside of webcomics, like, for instance, Kickstarter.
Kickstarter is really, really good for promotion, actually, but obviously you need to have done all the work beforehand. If you're doing a Kickstarter, I would highly recommend writing a press release and sending it to every comic review website that you can find. If you go to their contact information, you can find specific people who write about specific kinds of comics, indie comics, web comics. Send your press release to them to spread the word. And it's also just such a great way to pull in new readers. I had so many people who found Inhibit through Kickstarter. They bought the book just blind, and they now read the webcomic, or they're waiting for the next book.
A webcomic isn't exactly a small commitment, and some of the best-known names in the field have already seen their 20th anniversaries. How do you keep yourselves going? What is it that keeps you publishing new pages? And as we teased in the beginning, how do you keep yourself from going around the bend doing it?
So over the long term, and specifically for new comic creators who maybe haven't done a lot, like a really long project, I can only really talk for long form webcomics rather than strip or shorter stories. You have to set yourself a schedule from the start, and the first schedule that you set cannot be 3 pages a week. It has to be 1 page, just to try and make sure that you can keep that pace.
I mean, actually, I really do tend to keep to a schedule in terms of what is posted. But often that's just by doing a ton of pages ahead so that I can just take like a month off or 2 months off. Whether that is just to be able to take things at a slower pace, or if it's so I can do client work or a Kickstarter or shop stuff or something else that's part of my income.
We built up a good buffer of content, and that's just something that I would recommend every person who's considering about jumping into webcomics. Make sure you have a serious buffer before you launch your work, because you don't want to be sitting there week to week, especially if you're an artist. I mean, I couldn't imagine working a job and then coming home and trying to crank out a page every week to make it for a Wednesday or Tuesday deadline. That's a lot of work. That's a lot of pressure on yourself. So I would say make sure to have a good buffer so you can continue to produce content, continue to engage your readership, and have people coming back every week.
You can always increase the amount of pages you put out, or whatever your format is, but you need to start slow so that you don't just blast through.
You can't burn yourself out, because if you burn yourself out, it's going to make you want to quit, and it's not a good feeling if you want to quit or you do quit after putting in so much work, you know. So I would say, yeah, just pace yourself, be patient with yourself, and just go from there.
In the words of Mark Ruffalo, that's my secret. I'm always burnt out. The fact of the matter is, for me and Jen, at least, or at least me, I guess I can't speak for Jen, I'm always fighting burnout. We are routinely put on hiatus, both large and small, for the injuries we have accrued specifically making comics, and specifically this comic.
That physical labor that goes into just artwork is not a joke. So, uh, and I'll say this to other writers out there: you have to be really understanding of the people that you're working with. Uh, Drawing a comic is not easy work. It's hard. As you said, it could cause physical damage if someone's being overworked. Um, and as far as the artists that I work with, it's a no pressure situation. Yes, I'm commissioning everything, but I'm not trying to drive someone into burnout or hurting themselves or anything like that. So you really have to keep in mind that these are human beings that you're working with, and they're vulnerable to breakdowns, real life, physical injuries, everything. So it's you have to be mindful of that stuff.
For the Enchanted Book, the main character, Tula, her mother has passed away. And when I was writing the Enchanted Book, uh, that sort of situation with Tula and her mother who had passed, that was sort of a way for me to work through my grief of losing someone else. But in 2018, same year that the Enchanted Book launched, my mum was diagnosed with terminal brain cancer. And to be able to come back to that, like I just started drawing a section where Tula was sort of confronting her mother in a dream. I had to work on that obviously, like after I took my break, but if I hadn't taken that break, I would not have been able to process my emotions about the situation that I was in. I was really tempted to just drop the whole thing. I was like, no, I can't work on this anymore. It hits way too close to home. But actually, I found that it helped. It helped me sort of process what I was going through myself.
To be completely honest, unhealthy workaholism is often the only way I pull through the bad times. And I don't recommend any of that. That is very unhealthy. I recognize it as unhealthy, and I should put more time into self-care, which is very important.
I actually had to go to physiotherapy in 2018 as well. 2018 was just a bad year for me. I was definitely pushing myself too hard at the beginning of the year because also I had an art related job that took a huge toll on me physically as well as mentally. Um, and I think when I started having to use a wrist brace for the first time, I was like, okay, wait, this is too much. I already had like bandages on my neck and stuff. I had to like take time off of work to be able to go to physiotherapy. It was also expensive because I couldn't get it through the NHS.
It happens, it will happen to everyone. There's no escaping it. It's I have like literally around my desk, I used to have it in my kitchen, stretch sheets. So when I was making tea, I would be like, oh, okay, there's like a little diagram of some exercises, and I guess I'll stretch while I'm here. Or if I'm bored, I'm waiting for like something to load Photoshop to open a file, I'm like, okay, I guess I'll stretch. And that's been really helpful for me to kind of remind myself to stretch, because otherwise I get so focused on what I'm doing, I don't eat or stretch or leave my chair for like 5 hours. So if you're not stretching, make it easier to stretch. Like just tell yourself to stretch. You have to stretch.
Since learning to take breaks, I also learned that it's okay to take breaks for no reason. Like taking a break for a very serious reason, like my mom becoming ill, is, obviously completely valid. But I've also realized that it's completely valid to just take a break because your arm is starting to hurt, and you can take a month break, you can take a couple of months of break. your physical health is well more important than, you know, getting a webcomic out there, especially if you're not being paid for it, especially if it's not consistent pay.
If you are being paid for it, it's not a fair page rate. You're not getting paid a living wage to make this thing. You don't have to treat it like a real job in that aspect. You can just take a break. That's a very specific thing, but I do see it a lot where creators are like, I'm really, really sorry, I do need to take a break. It's like, you have nothing to be sorry for. You're a living person. You have other responsibilities. You're also just allowed to take a break. If there's no reason, you just want a break, you're allowed to just take one.
I think as long as you're keeping people in the know about like what's happening, then there's really no reason why you shouldn't be taking those breaks. I've definitely become a lot more accepting, I guess.
If I have to take 2 months off to do client work, doing client work or like not being able to work on webcomics is the thing that makes me realize like, oh, I really miss doing that. Like I really miss these characters and stuff. And often when I come back to it, I'm much more willing to like put in the work to make it look good or kind of just keep chipping away.
Webcomics are just, comics in general are just a thing that you're not going to do them and finish them if you don't love them. So you do have to just have this insatiable urge to create stories and to tell stories in order to get yourself through what is a really painful and kind of lonely process. If you're working with a partner, like a creative partner, you have a little bit more interaction and you kind of get to discuss your story. But for the most part, when you're drawing it or when you're writing it, you're alone. And when you finally get to release it, it's a great feeling.
Really, I think that like if you don't at least start with a story that you like really want to tell for its own sake, like I just mean that like people who are getting into webcomics because they feel like they ought to as like a career thing or a practice thing, just like might not get that much out of the experience.
You know, when I've finished a page, because I'm the last one to work on a page, I do the coloring and the lettering, and when I'm sitting there, you know, looking at Photoshop with a final finished page on screen, like it's a pretty good high, and it's a high that we chase over and over again, page by page.
You know, when you get like likes or notifications on social media, it's like giving you a little dopamine like rush. That's why people want to be keeping on using it. So I think I always felt like harnessing that like excitement about getting like a comment or a like and using that to motivate myself to do a really long story that might be difficult to finish otherwise is like a big advantage of webcomics to me.
The way I motivate myself is that I just love my comic to pieces and I love thinking about it. So it's exciting for me to get to work on it and it's like a treat. So sometimes it's work and sometimes it's like, ooh, I'll do some client work and then I'll do some Inhibit, and it's like a motivating thing that gets me through other work.
Just a passion for writing and creating and wanting to put my stories out there for people to consume. Like, honestly, that's what keeps me going. And it's like, yeah, and I have days where I'm like, why am I doing this? Yeah, it's rough. I'm not making much money off of it. I'm spending money. And then, you know, I snap out of it because it's like, I can't see myself not wanting to do it, you know?
I love the story that I've made, and the message is something that I'm really passionate about. And, you know, I'm working out some like personal things through these characters and their story and like what I put them through. And having pre-built like such a rich world for them, even if it's currently just in my head right now, it makes me want to explore that even further. The important thing is that I'm interested in it. I'm making a story that I'm interested in.
To wrap us up, one last question for the group. What is the single best, most important piece of wisdom you've picked up in your time as a creator?
Something that was really valuable to me that helped me grow a lot as a comic creator, as a writer, as an artist, was making friends with people who are at the same stage in their like career as me. And I met them through Twitter, through hashtag events, through conventions. it's all people who had started making work about the same time as me. They were at the same sort of readership level as me, and we all kind of grew up together. So I would say like Harry is in that, Alex Hassan, Spire Eaton, so many, like loads and loads of people. I couldn't name them all. And having that community to kind of fall back on and ask questions, to ask advice, to ask critique, feedback, has been so valuable to me because, like I said earlier, webcomics is a lonely, lonely game, and having the backing of creators who have experience in things you don't will make you a better creator and a better artist. You'll get tips on how to promote that you wouldn't have known. You'll get tips on how to make your writing better.
That you don't need to have a huge following to be successful in webcomics, or to have a successful to have a successful career in art in general. You don't need to be famous to make money. Webcomics can open up so many different avenues for you. You can meet like so many new people. It helps you grow and learn more about yourself as well. So yeah, I think that would be the main thing, is like don't focus on the numbers. The most important thing, this is something that I like sort of say to anyone who's sort of asked for advice, is don't focus on making a big following in terms of number. Focus on creating a good relationship, a good base with the readers and the fans who are already there. Appreciate them, and that will pay off way more in the long run.
Leave some lore questions unanswered. It's always tempting to fill in every single hole first, because that makes you feel like a better storyteller. That makes you feel like, you know, you've got everything airtight, you know everything. But I think it's important sometimes to leave a question unanswered. Like if you have a character who you've introduced who you haven't solidified the backstory for, you know, perfectly, or maybe you introduced an object that on the page seems suspiciously important, but you don't know exactly what it's for yet. I think those can be a secret weapon, because we've already done it a couple times in Rising Sand. And when you circle back around to those things, because you're eventually going to have an aha moment where you're like, oh, I can tie this back into that thing that I totally beefed on having an explanation for earlier. And when you fill in those holes, it makes you look like a cool genius who knew what they were doing the whole time.
Webcomics is very good at you being able to make whatever you want. And I think that as a creator, it's very easy to feel like you need to be making what is popular at the moment, or you need to be making something that's similar to something else that's done well, or you need to work in a particular art style or genre or theme. And I think that maybe my main advice is just to do like whatever you want, just to be the like beauty of webcomics is that you can really do anything. You can make it as niche and weird as you want it to be, you know, like as long as you're not like hurting anyone by doing anything like terrible. I just kind of think that like almost like it's a great opportunity to be as like fully on your bull as possible. And I often think that when you read someone else's comics, you can tell the bits that they're really excited about or the genres that they really love.
You have to be patient with yourself. Just realize that this is not going to happen overnight. I'm not going to get 1,000 people to come to my page. I'm not going to have 10,000 page views within the first week that I start. It doesn't work like that, especially if you don't have a following. Like me, I started out, no one knew who I was. So I had to build that up gradually over the last 5 years, and it's working. So I would say just be patient with yourself. Create a buffer. Make sure you have enough content so when you launch, you're not burning yourself out. This is for artists, especially. Like, you don't want to see you guys get injured or just getting frustrated. So definitely build up a good library of content before you even consider launching, and just be patient with the process, and trial and error. just remember, try things, see if it works for you. If it doesn't, great. If it works for you, roll with it. And again, just be patient with yourself.
And that's it for today. I'd like to thank our panel for taking the time to chat with us. If you enjoyed this video, check out some of the other great content being released as part of the Thought Bubble Fringe event. Look up the hashtag TBF20 on Twitter and Instagram to learn more. Thanks for watching.